Great album streaks. Most of the all-time great bands will have a streak of albums that most of their fans will argue is their peak. It's their greatest streak of albums. It's their golden era. And in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the Stones' peak, their golden era. What most fans will argue is the Stones at their best. This was 1968 until 1972. So the four albums that the Stones released in this period were Beggars Banquet, Let It Bleed, Sticky Fingers and Exile on Main Street. Now most fans out there will argue that these four albums back to back was the Stones at their peak, and there will even be some out there that will argue that this is the greatest streak of albums of all time by anybody. And that's kind of what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to look at why people think this. We're going to look at the story of the Stones in this period, and then I'm going to look, in my personal opinion, about what I think of this streak. Do I think this is the greatest streak of albums of all time? What do I think of them? That's what we're going to be looking at here in today's video. Now obviously that is going to be my opinion, that bit, so please do share your opinions in the comments. Do you agree, do you disagree with what I'm going to say? I won't spoil it, it'll be towards the end of the video, because before that we've got to talk about the story of the Stones in this period, which is very exciting. Now in order to avoid this video turning out to be like 3 hours long, I'm not going to do like an in-depth analysis of every song on each of these albums. If you do want to know what I think about each track on these albums, though, I have done a video reviewing each of these albums. There's a Beggars Banquet review, Let It Bleed review, etc, etc. So I'll remember, if I can, to link those 4 videos down below so you can see my thoughts on each of these albums individually, each of these tracks on these albums individually, I should say. I should pre-warn you though, the one for Beggars Banquet especially is an old video. It's from like 2018, I think, 2017, 2018. I think it's 2018. God knows what I say in that video. My opinion is maybe completely different to what I say in that video. But yeah, if you want to know a more in-depth view of what I at least thought of every track on that album in 2018, there's a link down below. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into this. Let's go into the Stones from 1968 to 1972. So to begin with, we need to go back to 1967. Now this was when psychedelic rock was at its absolute peak. The Beatles were riding high this year with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and the Stones, seeing this success that the Beatles had had with that album, they decided therefore that they wanted in on this. They wanted in on the psychedelic movement that was going on at the time. However, 1967 would turn out to be one of the hardest years that the Rolling Stones would ever have. It might be the toughest year of their entire career. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were both arrested, and they very, very nearly ended up in prison. In fact, they were sentenced to prison. I think, was it 6 months for Mick and a year for Keith? I can't remember, it might have been different, don't quote me on that.
Sternly to Richard that the offence of which he'd been found guilty carried a maximum sentence of 10 years, there was a gasp of pure horror from the youngsters crowded into the public gallery. But there was a dead silence as the judge added, "You will go to prison for 1 year and you will pay £500 towards the cost of the prosecution. Go down." Richard, who earlier had talked in his evidence of what he called petty morals, went down to the cells without expression. Jagger, who was wearing a primrose frilled shirt with pleated yellow lace cuffs, put his hand to his face as he was given 3 months with £100 cost. For a moment he looked like fainting, then prison officers moved forward to take his arms and help him down to the cells.
But anyway, they eventually got their sentences quashed, so they got let out, luckily. But yeah, they very, very nearly did end up in prison. And Brian Jones was also losing himself more and more and more to the world of drugs. So whilst all this was going on, the band was still working away on their next album, Their Satanic Majesty's Request. Now during the recording of this album, their manager and producer, Andrew Loog Oldham, would quit. Now he had been their producer and their manager since the very beginning. He had been the one who had signed them, the one who had discovered them, the one who had made them famous really, and he'd had enough. He felt this album was directionless. He felt the band was directionless. He didn't want anything to do with it anymore, and Mick and Keith's drug bust was the final straw for him. So he jumped ship. So therefore the Stones would have to self-produce this album. Now this is the first time and the only time I think where an album has been put out where it's credited produced by the Rolling Stones. Obviously Mick and Keith would eventually become producers known as the Glimmer Twins, but the Glimmer Twins, this was long before they were a thing, and therefore all 5 of the Stones get production credit on this album. The one and only time that has happened. Anyway, Their Satanic Majesty's Request would be released on December 8th, 1967, and upon its release it was absolutely slated. It was panned by fans and critics alike. Most people just seen this as a failed knockoff of Sgt. Pepper really. It was just the Stones trying to outdo the Beatles and failing miserably. So yeah, a lot of people to this day don't like this album. It's often considered one of the Stones' worst albums, but I don't know why. I personally really like the album. Plus it's got a 3D cover. Look at that cover. I mean, look at that. Look at that, it's 3D, man. Don't know if that's coming across, but it's a 3D cover. What's not to like? It's a gimmick cover. But it was only the original copies that were pressed in 3D, and then they completely destroyed, the record label destroyed the original artwork, so it couldn't be reproduced because it was that expensive. This is a 50th anniversary edition re-release of it. But even this isn't the true 3D cover because it's sort of a recreation of it, which is a shame. It's a gimmick. It was originally supposed to be the full size as well, but the reason why it isn't the full size is because of how much it costs. But yeah, it's a brilliant cover. I really like this cover. Anyway, like I say, this album, it was panned and the Stones were left looking for a new direction. This hadn't worked for them. So as they went into 1968, they needed to change their ways. 1968, arguably a coming of age for the Rolling Stones. They decided straight away to ditch the psychedelic vibe that they'd been going for in 1967. They would therefore replace this by going back to their roots, this more blues rock and roll style. They would also decide that they need to find themselves a new producer, and they would find this in the form of Jimmy Miller. Now Jimmy Miller would join the band for Beggars Banquet, and he would produce everything they would do through this golden period, 1968 to 1972. Everything they did in this period, Jimmy Miller would produce. He would also produce Goat's Head Soup in 1973. But that's a story for another day, although I do love that album. Anyway, Jimmy Miller was now on board and the Stones were ready to get cracking. So the sessions for Beggars Banquet would begin on March 17, 1968, primarily at Olympic Studios in London. So with Jimmy Miller now on board as producer, they would also need an engineer, and this would be Glyn Johns. Now Glyn had actually been a long-time collaborator with the Stones. He'd been their engineer for quite some time. I don't actually know when he started, I should have checked that. I imagine it was probably Aftermath, the first thing he did with them, but I know he definitely was on Satanic Majesties anyway. So Glyn was involved as the engineer, and his first observation of these sessions was how much the songs had changed, how much more mature they had become. It was like a coming of age. It's like they'd suddenly grown up. The music they were bringing in to record was substantially better than anything they had done up until this point. Now throughout these sessions for Beggars Banquet, arguably Keith Richards would be the hardest working Stone. Now the reason for this is because the band had effectively become an unofficial four-piece by this point, consisting of Keith, Mick Jagger, Bill Wyman and Charlie Watts. Now officially they were a five-piece, but there was only four of them that could be relied on. And because the other guitarist, who we're going to get onto in a sec, was unreliable, shall we say, Keith had to sort of take on two roles, the role of himself and the role of Brian Jones. Unfortunately, by this point, Brian Jones had become less and less frequent at attending Rolling Stones sessions. He would only really show up sporadically, no one knew when he was going to show up, and this would therefore leave Keith with a lot more work to do. He would have to double up, he would have to do his own stuff plus the stuff that Brian should be doing. Now whenever Brian did show up for the sessions, he would become quite emotional. This was due to his ever-increasing drug abuse and his already pre-existing emotional problems. As a side note, I think in this day and age, if Brian Jones was about, he'd probably have something that was picked up on. Part of me thinks is Brian Jones autistic. Obviously in the 60s, something like that would never be picked up on. But he does come across a bit autistic. Story for another day, that though. Anyway, on the subject of Brian Jones appearing at these sessions, Jimmy Miller would later say the following about it. When he would show up at a session, let's say he had brought a sitar that day, he'd feel like playing it, so he'd look at his calendar and see if the Stones were in. Now he may have missed the previous 4 sessions. We'd be doing, let's say, a blues thing. He'd then walk in with a sitar, which was completely irrelevant to what we were doing, and he'd want to play it. I used to try and accommodate him. I would isolate him, put him in a booth, and not record him onto any track that we really needed. And the others, particularly Mick and Keith, would often say to me, just tell him to piss off and get the hell out of here. Now it is sad what happened to Brian Jones. At the end of the day, the Rolling Stones, they were his band. He started it, he named it, he was the original leader, and now he was just a shell of his former self. He was just getting put away in the corner just to do his own thing that was no contribution to anything really. However, during the sessions for Beggars Banquet, the old Brian would show himself very occasionally, particularly on the track No Expectations. Now Mick has later said that this was the last time he remembers Brian contributing something to the Rolling Stones that was truly Brian. He would contribute the slide guitar to No Expectations, beautiful slide guitar, the highlight of that song, and it's a beautiful piece. It's quite sad to listen to, knowing that Brian was more or less on his way out by that point.
Take me to the station and put me on a train. I've got got no expectations.
The future as a Rolling Stone is very uncertain. My ultimate aim in life was never to be a pop star. I enjoy it, with reservations, but I'm not really sort of satisfied either artistically or personally.
So during the sessions for Beggars Banquet, a film crew would actually enter Olympic Studio during some of the sessions to film the band recording Sympathy for the Devil. Now this was for a film of the same title. Now if you've never seen the film, I'm going to tell you a little bit about it now. So it's kind of a film of two halves. Half of it is this really obscure 60s avant-garde sort of thing. The other half of it is the Stones recording Sympathy for the Devil. So one half of it, I'll be honest, it's hard going, it's utter crap. The other half of it is really interesting stuff. If you've never seen it, I wish they'd release an edited version of it which just had the bits with the Stones, because that is truly fascinating stuff. It's like they bring it in with nothing. It's effectively being built up from nothing to the finished thing. Yeah, its earliest form to its finished form. It's great. Plus, it's also where you get to see Charlie Watts singing the backing vocals, doing the woo-woos. And he absolutely hates it. It's clear as day on his face that he is not enjoying it. So yeah, the film Sympathy for the Devil, that was obviously the Stones portion of that was recorded during the Beggars Banquet sessions. If you've never seen the film, it's definitely worth watching. It is very much a piece of its time for half of the film anyway. Yeah, I think it was remastered not so long ago, so it's in pretty good quality these days. I just don't get when they remastered it, why they didn't think, right, we'll take out all this avant-garde bullshit and just leave the interesting stuff. The reason why, let's be honest, I was going to say 90%, 100% of people I can confidently say are going to watch the film. It's to see the Stones creating Sympathy for the Devil. There we go though. The sessions for Beggars Banquet would also spawn the non-album single Jumpin' Jack Flash. You may have heard of it. This was released on May 24th, 1968, and it was the first thing the Stones had released since their Satanic Majesty's request. Definitely a return to form. It's arguably one of the greatest rock and roll songs of all time. So yeah, Jumpin' Jack Flash spawned from the sessions for Beggars Banquet, but it wouldn't go on the album. Because in the 60s that wasn't a thing, you couldn't put your singles onto albums. So the sessions for Beggars Banquet would conclude on July 25th, 1968. That was the album now finished and ready to go. However, it would not be released for many, many months. And this was because an argument would break out between the Rolling Stones and their record label at the time, Decca. So this argument was over the artwork for the album. Now the original artwork for Beggars Banquet was supposed to be this, the toilet cover with all the graffiti on. Now at the time, Decca, they weren't on for this, they didn't like it, they probably thought it was offensive or something, so they rejected it. Nope, you can't put that out, and this would delay the album because they'd be going back and forward, arguing for months and months and months about whether or not they can have this cover. In the end though, the record label would win and this would not get released at the time. Instead, the cover would be this. If I reach down here, this would, this is going to be probably unprofessional and undignified, but there, oh no, it's worked first time. There you go. So that would be the cover that would get released originally, Beggars Banquet. It's very different, it's quite boring. Now the idea of this cover, it's supposed to be an invitation. It's a fancy invitation basically to a formal ball, that kind of thing, a formal banquet. Now this would come out eventually, December 1968, December 6th, 1968 it came out. And this was just after the Beatles had released the White Album. Now, bear in mind that not so long ago they just released, the Beatles had put out Sgt. Pepper, the Stones had put out Satanic Majesties not long after that. And there was accusations that the Stones had effectively tried to copy the Beatles and the cover of Sgt. Pepper, and now they're doing this just after the Beatles have released the White Album. I mean, again, it would draw in the parallels, people going, oh, the Stones are just copying the Beatles, which is a bit unfair in this instance because obviously the Stones didn't want this as the cover. The Beatles, well technically the Beatles didn't originally want this as the cover because this was originally going to be called A Doll's House, but that's a story for another day. But yeah, the Stones got lumbered with this originally at the time, but in subsequent releases, obviously, in re-releases, that's been ditched and that has been released as the cover. So officially now the cover for Beggars Banquet is the original cover. It's just original copies. Had to make do with that. So there you go, that delayed the album because there was an argument about that being offensive and getting it replaced with that. That's the 50th anniversary edition that was released, by the way, in case you're wondering. Waiting for a girl, we get drunk on Friday night, cha-cha-cha. Waiting for a factory girl, la la la. Anyway, like I said, Beggar's Banquet was released on December 6th, 1968, and it would peak at number 3 in the UK charts and number 5 in the US charts. Now, I imagine the thing that held it off number 1 was probably the White Album, because that had only come out like a week or two before. I don't know what was at number 2 that held it off, but whatever. It wouldn't get to number 1, but critically and with fans, this album was very well received. It was a true return to form, and like I say, this would begin a streak of great albums for the Rolling Stones. This was where it started, with Beggar's Banquet. Now, in 1968, the Rolling Stones weren't touring, so they needed to find another way to try and promote this album. So they would devise this idea of a film, a television film called The Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus. Basically, they would have a load of acts perform, and then to close it off, the Stones would perform a number of tracks from Beggar's Banquet. So this was filmed on December 11th and 12th of 1968, and it would never get released at the time because the Stones weren't happy with it. So basically, without going into it too much, what happened was Brian Jones, this would be his last ever performance with the Rolling Stones, but by this point he could hardly function, the poor guy. Just watch any footage of the film that's been released, photos of Brian from the film, and you can tell he is not a well man. He is not long left for this world. Well, he wasn't, he only had about another 6 months left by this point. And his guitar, they didn't even plug it in. He was strumming away on stage, playing away, but he wasn't plugged in. So obviously it kind of, in many ways, it lacked the oomph, the power of 2 guitars, because there was only one. It was only Keith on the guitar. Brian would also apparently not really get involved with any of the other acts. He would sort of just isolate himself away, sort of seclude himself away, just not get involved with anyone else. He was just in his own little world by this point, really. Anyway, with all this going on, The Who would end up upstaging the Rolling Stones at this, and the Stones weren't happy to be upstaged at their own event, so that was why it never got released at the time, and it just remained on the cutting room floor. It would eventually get released, obviously, in 1996. You can see it if you want to see the film. The album has also been released. It's not a bad performance. I mean, yeah, arguably The Who did upstage the Stones, and it's very interesting because it's obviously the last time Brian did perform with them. It wasn't switched off for everything. I think his guitar can be heard on Jumpin' Jack Flash, and I think, yeah, his slide guitar is there on No Expectations, but I don't think his slide guitar is on Salt of the Earth though. But anyway, that, like I say, that's the last time that Brian would ever play with the Stones, unfortunately. Anyway, the Rock and Roll Circus, it would highlight an issue for the Stones, a growing issue, something that was getting worse and worse for them. Brian Jones, something needed to be done. So it's time for us now to head into 1969. Oh, 1969. I tell you what, I'm going to take my jacket off for this. Oh, it's a bit too warm, you see, to wear a jacket. Right, here we go then, 1969 for the Rolling Stones. In many ways, 1969, it was kind of, to begin with, just a continuation of 1968. It was kind of just the same stuff, really. Now, they wasted no time at all getting to work on their next album, Let It Bleed. The sessions would actually start in November 1968. This first session would be for You Can't Always Get What You Want. However, they wouldn't really do much with it. It would be February 1969 when the sessions properly got going, once again at Olympic Studio. Now, these sessions, they would take place sporadically throughout 1969 up until November of 69. Now, these sessions would primarily take place once again at Olympic Studios in London. However, there would be some overdubs that would be done in Los Angeles later in 1969. And once again, Jimmy Miller would serve as the producer for everything that was recorded in 1969. So once again, just like Beggar's Banquet, Let It Bleed would consist primarily of the Stones recording it as a 4-piece. Keith would have to double up again and play both lead and rhythm guitar. Brian Jones, once again, he was quite sporadic in when he arrived and when he wouldn't arrive. He wasn't there all that often by this point, to be honest, and when he was there, he couldn't really do anything. He was intoxicated most of the time. Once again, Jimmy Miller would do the same thing as he'd done in Beggar's Banquet. He would sort of put Brian away in his corner to do his own thing, just sort of strum away on guitar or sitar or whatever the hell Brian felt like bringing in. And yeah, nothing would be used. They just sort of were humouring him, I suppose, in the corner, which is really sad. It is. It's really sad that the man who started the band, the most talented of all of them, I think, in terms of the instruments he could play. I mean, Brian seemed to have this ability to play any instrument he wanted, and now he's just being shoved in a corner. So yeah, it is really sad, but he was getting worse and worse by this point. Now, the band were getting more and more tired of Brian by this point. They were getting really pissed off. They were getting really weary with him. and they were also wanting to go on tour in 1969 at the back end of the year. And well, Brian, he was in no fit state to tour, so this was creating yet another problem for them. Now, at some point during the sessions around May 1969, Brian Jones would actually have a motorcycle accident, so he wouldn't be able to attend any of the sessions throughout May 1969. And during this period, Mick Taylor would be brought in to play some guitar on the track Live With Me. Now, at this point, he's just a session musician, he's not an official Stone. But yeah, he was brought in to play on Live With Me, and this would potentially start planting a seed into Mick and Keith's brain in particular. So by June of 1969, the situation with Brian had reached breaking point. So far, he'd only contributed 2 things to Let It Bleed, also a harp on You've Got the Silver, and some percussion on Midnight Rambler. So the band had truly had enough now. He was just a liability, he was just sort of holding them back in some ways. Now, like I say, in the back end of 1969, the Stones were wanting to go on tour in America, but there was a problem. Brian, he couldn't tour, he was not in a fit state to go on tour, he could barely function in the studio, let alone on the road. Plus, he'd been convicted a few times by this point for drug possession. This would therefore present him with visa issues if he tried to go into America. So they had no choice, they needed to solve this problem once and for all. So one day during June 1969, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards and Charlie Watts, they went round to Brian's house. I don't know why Bill didn't go, I don't know if Bill didn't agree with this, he didn't want any part in it, but he didn't go anyway. So anyway, those 3 went and they effectively fired Brian, they kicked him out the band, they said, that's it, we've done it, we can't do any more with you. So that was it, Brian was no longer in the band that Brian had started. It was his band, he'd named it, he'd started it and he'd been kicked out of it. So yeah, that was the end of Brian and the Rolling Stones. Anyway, with Brian now gone, the Stones would formally invite Mick Taylor to come and join the band, having been impressed by his work during the May 1969 session of Live With Me. So by the time Mick Taylor had joined the band, most of the basic tracks for Let It Bleed had been completed, most of the songs weren't far off finished. This included the non-album single Honky Tonk Women. However, this was due to come out any day now, it was an impending release, and with Mick Taylor now officially a Rolling Stone, they needed him on this new single, effectively to introduce him to the world. So Mick Taylor would overdub some additional lead guitar parts onto Honky Tonk Women. He would also get to put some slide guitar onto Country Honk, which was the original version of Honky Tonk Women, the country and western version of it, that can be heard on Let It Bleed as track number 3. So the Stones were intending to make their live return to stage in July 1969. This would be a free gig at Hyde Park, their first concert to anybody, any paying audience I should say, since 1967, so their first in 2 years. Now this concert in Hyde Park, like I say, it was going to be a free concert, anyone could attend, it was a gathering of the people. And the day before this concert, on July 4th, 1969, the single Honky Tonk Women would be released. Now this song, to date at least I should say, because the Stones are still going, this is the Stones' most recent #1 single. Nothing they released after this in terms of singles would ever go to #1, interestingly. That's in the UK, I should add, no idea about America. Probably they've had other #1 singles there, but here at least, in the country of their origin, yeah, Honky Tonk Women is their most recent #1 single. So yeah, they had all this planned out. Honky Tonk Women on July 4th, this free concert, their return to the live stage on July 5th, 1969. What could possibly go wrong for them now? Everything, it would turn out, because on July 3rd, 1969, a tragedy would take place.
About midnight, Jones went for a swim with his Swedish girlfriend, Anna Volin, and another friend, Mr. Frank Thorogood. After a time, Mr. Thorogood and the girl went back to the house. When they returned, they saw Jones at the bottom of the pool, and they pulled him out.
Approximately 3 weeks after being fired by his bandmates, Brian Jones passed away after drowning in his swimming pool. The official coroner's report stated the cause of death was death by misadventure. He was 27 years old. So because of this tragedy, the Hyde Park gig would now change its tone completely. It had gone from just being a free gig, the Stones' return to the live stage, to now being a memorial gig for Brian. Now at the start of this gig, Mick Jagger would read a poem in tribute to Brian, and then they would set off a load of doves in his memory. Now 500,000 people would attend this concert, this free concert in Hyde Park. It's probably one of the biggest concerts ever in London, this. And yeah, it's really sad knowing that they'd just lost Brian at this point, and it's quite remarkable that they managed to go on stage. So Brian's funeral would take place a few days after the Hyde Park gig, and only Bill Wyman and Charlie Watts from the Rolling Stones would attend it. Now at the time, Mick Jagger was on his way to Australia to begin filming his upcoming film project, Ned Kelly, and Keith just didn't bother going. He didn't see the point in funerals, because he didn't go to his mother's funeral, he didn't go to his father's funeral or anything like that. So yeah, he didn't see the point in going to Brian's funeral. And I'm sorry, but it is absolutely disgusting that Mick and Keith did not bother going to Brian's funeral. It's not like either of them had a good excuse. Mick could have delayed going to Australia, and Keith, to be honest, quite frankly, his reason's disgusting. You know, it's a cop-out, I don't care what he says. He could have gone, both of them could have gone. I think it's an absolute disgrace that they didn't go. I think they really let Brian down by not going. I think they damaged their image as well in not going, to be honest, because it just makes them look heartless. And in some ways, in later years, they still come across heartless, because in interviews to this day, really, they still never really have anything nice to say about Brian. It's only really Bill Wyman that's ever got anything nice to say about him anymore. But yeah, basically the fact they didn't go to his funeral, I think is disgusting. And I do wonder, did Keith go to Charlie's funeral recently? Because, you know, did Charlie get the same excuse of, oh, well, I didn't go to my mother's funeral, I didn't go to my father's funeral or anything like that? I bet he went to Charlie's funeral. It's disgusting. I'm sorry, it really does annoy me. It annoys me more than it probably should, that they didn't bother going to his funeral. I mean, with friends like that, who needs enemies? Anyway, coming back to Let It Bleed here, it was originally supposed to come out in July 1969, but for some reason it was delayed. They obviously didn't feel it was finished. It was missing some of its overdubs, including the iconic backing vocals on Gimme Shelter. Now further overdubs would take place in LA in October and November of 1969. So yeah, like I say, during the LA overdub sessions, this was when Mary Clayton got to overdub those legendary backing vocals onto Gimme Shelter. The best backing vocals probably ever. I mean, Gimme Shelter, is there a better record out there than that? There's definitely, I don't think, a better opening track than Gimme Shelter. That is one thing about this album, greatest opening track of all time. I can't think of a single opening track that tops this one, and it's thanks to Mary Clayton's backing vocals. It's just, it's a powerhouse. But anyway, yes, these were recorded in 1969's LA sessions for Let It Bleed. But that wasn't really the reason they were in America. The main reason they'd now gone to America was to begin their US tour. So the Rolling Stones' 1969 US tour would run from November 7th until December 6th, and the set consisted primarily of tracks from Beggar's Banquet and Let It Bleed. Let It Bleed's release was now impending. So yes, Let It Bleed, this album here, it was released whilst the Stones were on this tour. It was released on December 5th, 1969, although it came out slightly earlier in America on November 28th, 1969 for some reason. And yeah, once again, it was a well-received album. It was continuing the streak. The album would actually reach #1 in the UK. It would dethrone Abbey Road for a little bit, although Abbey Road would then knock this back off #1. In the US, it would only get to #3. I imagine it was probably Abbey Road that held it off #1 and something else. I don't know what the other album will have been. But yeah, Let It Bleed, it was a continuation of the streak. It was another fantastic album from the Rolling Stones. And I've always found what's quite interesting about this is, despite the fact Mick Taylor is in the band by this point, I think this is Brian Jones on the cover, this little figure. It's Brian, plus Brian's on that bit there. So I think that's quite interesting that they actually bothered to include Brian on the cover. Now Brian, this is the last album that he's on, although he was sadly no longer alive by this point. But he is on this album, like I say. He played the auto harp on You Got the Silver and some percussion on Midnight Rambler. So he's on 2 tracks, and Mick Taylor is also on 2 tracks. He plays guitar on Live With Me and some slide guitar on Country Honk. However, at the time, the release of this album was kind of overshadowed by something that was about to occur during the last date of the Stones' 1969 tour. So on December 6, 1969, the Rolling Stones had agreed to headline the Altamont Speedway Free Festival. Approximately 300,000 people would attend this free festival, and it was conceived to be the West Coast version of Woodstock. Woodstock had occurred a few months earlier at the time. However, Altamont would be marred with major issues, the biggest problem being the security situation. So what happened was Hell's Angels were asked to effectively act as the security. So what they were asked to do was sit at the front and just stop people from getting on the stage. Now, in return for doing this, they would obviously get to be at the front, but they would also be given free booze. And that was it. They weren't officially security, though. They were just sort of unofficial security. So it was kind of like the officials were expecting the Hells Angels to keep order, to just patrol the event, be security. whereas the Hells Angels just thought, well, we're just here like everyone else to enjoy it and get pissed for free effectively and just stop people from getting on the stage. So yeah, it was kind of an unlawful event. There was no real authority there. So once the Rolling Stones arrived at the festival, within seconds, and I mean seconds here, of Mick Jagger getting off the helicopter that had brought him here, he was punched in the face by someone. So this was basically a flavour of what was to come. Anyway, the Rolling Stones would eventually take to the stage. By the time they got on the stage, however, it had gotten dark and the crowd, they were really becoming quite unruly. Yeah, it was very much, there was no law. It was an unlawful event effectively. Yeah, it was a riot waiting to happen. Anyway, the Stones, they could kind of feel that it was a negative atmosphere, that something was going to happen. But because of the positioning of the stage, effectively it was at the bottom of a hill. So all the crowd was sort of like that down onto them. Plus there was no real security. So the Stones were kind of trapped because they couldn't just walk off, because if they walked off, there was nothing to stop the fans from just running at the stage. At the end of the day, there's 300,000 people there. Yeah, there's some Hells Angels sat at the front. But if 300,000 people decide to storm that stage, there's no Hells Angels going to be able to stop that. So the Stones were very much trapped. Now at one point during the show, whilst they were performing Sympathy for the Devil, Mick had to stop the concert to effectively calm the crowd down because they were getting more and more agitated. So yeah, there were fights breaking out between the Hells Angels and fans that were at the show, so Mick had to try and calm it down the best he could. However, it was whilst the band were performing Under My Thumb that things would truly take a darker turn. Meredith Hunter was a fan attending the show, and he was completely off his head on drugs throughout the entire performance, and he was enraged with both the Rolling Stones and the Hells Angels after earlier in the show a Hells Angel had punched him in the face. So whilst the Stones were performing Under My Thumb, Hunter made his way to the front of the crowd with a gun in his pocket, intending to shoot somebody on stage, most likely Mick Jagger. However, one of the Hells Angels spotted Hunter heading towards the stage with a gun, so he drew out his knife and stabbed Hunter to death. The Stones were completely unaware of what had just happened in the crowd and continued to play their set before finding out that someone was seriously hurt, so they had to stop the performance to try and get a doctor to the scene. Now the Stones would actually finish their set. The only reason why they didn't abandon it was to stop a full-scale riot breaking out, because as the show went on it got worse and worse and worse, the situation with the crowd. So they did eventually get to the end of the show, and once they'd finished their performance they very, very quickly scarpered. They pretty much ran for the helicopter and got out of there as quick as they could. Now the Altamont Speedway Free Festival was actually filmed, it was recorded by a professional film crew, and it would be released on the 1970 documentary film called Gimme Shelter, primarily though focused on the Rolling Stones' involvement in this. Anyway, they didn't know this at the time, but when they came to edit the film a few weeks later, or begin editing it, they actually discovered that they'd captured the stabbing on camera. Now I can't really include any footage of this because on YouTube, you know, you can't really include stabbings. Plus this is copyrighted video, so I don't want Alan Klein's lot coming after me. So unfortunately no footage, but if you do watch the film you can see the stabbing happen. They do discuss it, you see them, the Stones actually watching it happen. I think you get to watch Charlie watching the footage back of it happening. Yeah, it's quite impactful stuff really. So yeah, the film Gimme Shelter, it is worth watching. I've just kind of briefly glossed over this here. That film goes into the full thing in detail. It's really, really good. It's really powerful stuff. The whole festival was an absolute disaster really. So yeah, I can't recommend that film enough. It is really, really good. Anyway, so after this festival and the Stones had left, they then flew back to England, and they were kind of traumatised by what had gone on. They were shaken to their core by this. And yeah, Altamont in many ways, it was the death of the 60s and the 60s idea of peace and love. That was it, the 1960s were over. It was something new coming now. Here comes the 1970s. Look at that, I've changed my clothes. How have I done that? Magic. No, did you seriously think I was going to record a video this long in a single day? No chance. So it's a different day now. So yeah, change of clothes. I mean, I could have done continuity and wore the same thing throughout, but where would the fun in that be? Anyway, as the Stones entered 1970, they were left very shaken and quite traumatised after what had gone on at Altamont. Their public image had also changed because of this. Now, up until this point, they'd kind of always been seen as these rebels, these naughty rebels. They were nothing too serious. They were just these, like, the bad boys at school. There was, you know, it was nothing like, they weren't going to stab you or anything like that. They were just the sort of one who would pull your pants down for a laugh or something like that. That kind of rebel, not like stab you. But because someone had been stabbed at one of their concerts and killed, they were now seen as damn right dangerous. And it's not really an image you want your band to have, this image of being this dangerous bunch of hooligans, I suppose. So yeah, they now had to deal with this new image they had, the image of being a dangerous band. Anyway, by this point the band had already started actually working on their next album, Sticky Fingers. They actually did some sessions on December 2nd, 3rd and 4th, 1969 at Muscle Shoals in Alabama. Whilst they were there, they were quite productive actually. They recorded 3 tracks, You Gotta Move, Brown Sugar and Wild Horses. Plus they also had a song called Sister Morphine. This had been recorded in the Let It Bleed sessions in March 1969, but it didn't go on to Let It Bleed, it was held back for this next album. However, at the start of 1970, Sticky Fingers, it was parked for a little bit because the Stones had something else they needed to work on first. So the Stones were actually planning to release a live album from their 1969 US tour, and that was the next thing they were going to focus on releasing, which means this needs to go away for now. Actually, that's not what we need. Instead, we need that on there, because that's the next thing we are going to briefly talk about. That was professional. Get your yayas out for the lads. So this live album, it wouldn't actually just be one single concert it would take all the recordings from. It would be from a number of concerts, the 2 Madison Square Garden gigs and the Baltimore gig. However, the Stones felt that the vocals on these original recordings weren't up to standard to be released. So they felt they needed to re-record mixed vocals before it could be released. So these vocal overdubs would take place in January and February of 1970 at Olympic Studio in London. So the cover for this live album would also be taken in February 1970, and I've got to say, I absolutely love this cover. It is one of my favourite Rolling Stones covers. Now there were 2 sessions that took place for this cover in 2 different locations, 2 photo shoots I should say. Both of them involved Charlie and a donkey. The first one took place on the M6 at Birmingham, and the second one, which is the one that got used, took place at an airfield. I've got to say, personally, I think the one on the M6 would have been more interesting. But yeah, there you go. I mean, you wouldn't get away with that now, probably shutting a motorway to go and stand on it with a donkey. The traffic probably wouldn't cope these days, but back then it was fine because it was a lot quieter. But yeah, that's the cover, really good cover, really like the album cover. It is one of my favourite Stones covers, that. I mean, it's just the fact it's Charlie as well, it's brilliant. Love it. So the album Get Your Yayas Out wouldn't actually get released until September 4th, 1970, and upon its release it would manage to top the charts here in the UK. Now don't quote me on this because I might be wrong, but there's something in the back of my head telling me that this was actually the first live album to ever top the charts here in the UK, and it's a bloody good live album as well. So this album would also mark an ending point for the Stones. This would be the final thing they would ever release on Decca. Decca had been the record label that had signed them in 1963, 64, 1963 I think it was. Maybe even 1962. I think it was probably 1963 though, I should have checked that. But this was the last thing that they would release. The Stones had had enough of them, they wanted to go their own way. So the band decided in 1970 that it was time for a fresh start. They would leave Decca as their record label, and they would also leave Alan Klein as their manager. Now he'd been their manager now for quite a while, but before they could get rid of him properly, he dealt them quite a massive blow. They found out that they had inadvertently basically signed over all their copyrights to Alan Klein, everything they'd done in the 1960s. So everything from their very first single, Come On, Since Me and My Baby Party, Come On, up until their most recent release, which was going to be this, Get Your Yayas Out, they didn't own a single thing. Alan Klein owned the entire lot. Lovely man is Mr. Klein, thankfully no longer with us, and I know that's not a nice thing to say, but genuinely a really horrible man. Everything that is wrong with the music industry can be signified, it can be summed up perfectly in Alan Klein. He is the epitome of everything wrong in the music industry. Anyway, to this day, the Stones still do not own anything that they recorded in the 60s. They did at the time try and sue Klein over this because they hadn't intentionally given him everything, but unfortunately they lost the case. So yeah, there was nothing they could do. It was effectively just going to have to be a clean start away from Klein. But even then he wasn't done, because for Sticky Fingers, which somewhere, they'd already recorded a few songs for it. Particularly the focus here was on Brown Sugar and Wild Horses. Now in 1970 these songs hadn't been released, but they had been recorded whilst Klein was still their manager. So Klein argued, well, you know, these songs, I own these too. Now, thankfully with these ones at least, the Stones did manage to sort of end up with co-ownership. So Klein owns half of it, the Stones own half of it. So yeah, even on Sticky Fingers, Klein has still got his mucky fingers involved a little bit. And as if all this with Klein wasn't bad enough, Decca now wanted to stick their boot in, because they came up and said, hey Mick, Keith, you still owe us one more song, one more single. So they decided that they would try and get this dealt with once and for all. They would give them a song, but they knew full well they weren't going to release this song, because the song they gave them was called Cocksucker Blues. Now they purposely made this as crude as they possibly could, knowing full well that Decca would not release this. And lo and behold, they didn't release it. Instead, in the end, Decca would just re-release Street Fighting Man from Beggar's Banquet in 1968. So yeah, that would be their last single that would be released on Decca. So yeah, Cocksucker Blues, never. I don't think it's ever been officially released, I don't think. I think there is bootlegs of it out there, but I don't think it's ever been officially released.
Oh, where can I get my cock sucked? Where can I get my ass fucked? I may have no money, but I know where to put it every time.
Anyway, the Stones were now really ready for a fresh start, away from Decca, away from Klein and his cronies. So yeah, 1970, couldn't come soon enough, this fresh start. Anyway, the Stones would eventually turn their attention back to their next album, Sticky Fingers. The sessions for Sticky Fingers would properly get going on February 17th, 1970, and just like Let It Bleed, they would be quite sporadic. They would run sporadically until October 31st, 1970. So the sessions for Sticky Fingers would predominantly take place at the Rolling Stones' new mobile recording studio. This mobile recording studio would be something they would use quite a lot in the 1970s, and this was the first time that they used it. Now, throughout 1970, it was based for the most part at Mick's manor called Stargroves, this big, very country manor down south in England. Yeah, it's very aristocracy, you know, very, very, very posh looking. Anyway, yes, that's where it was based. That's where the vast amount of sessions for Sticky Fingers would take place. However, some additional sessions would also take place at Olympic Studios and Trident Studios, both in London. Now, it should probably go without saying by this point in the video, but guess who produced this album? Yep, it was Jimmy Miller. And obviously this would be the first full album that would feature Mick Taylor. And with Mick Taylor now in the band, this album was kind of a return to basics. Most of the tracks on this album are just guitar, drums and bass. The last few albums that they'd done, they'd had this kind of eclectic selection of instruments, predominantly thanks to Brian Jones and all the instruments that he could play. But Brian, he wasn't here anymore, so he had nothing to do with this album. So yeah, because of that, the instruments, it was much more down to basics basically. So in August 1970, the band decided that they would go on another tour. This time it would be of continental Europe. Now these shows would be their first since the Altamont gig at the back end of 1969. So this tour of Europe would be the Stones' first European tour since 1967, and it would be part of this pattern that they would start. For those of you that don't know what that is, basically the Stones, they had this pattern where they would do a tour of North America, they would then do a tour of continental Europe, and they would then do a tour of the UK. It was a 3-year cycle that they would do, then they would start again. So it was America, then Europe, then the UK, saving the best for last. Anyway, that would go on throughout most of the 70s and into the 80s before eventually it would be stopped. And then these days it's America, America, America. These days, stuff the rest of the world, it's America, sort of thing. Yeah, but back then, the rest of the world still obviously mattered to the Rolling Stones. Anyway, the shows on the 1970 tour would be mostly just the same thing as what had gone on in the 1969 tour, where the set list was more or less just the same. The big difference this time though was most of the crowd now actually knew the Let It Bleed songs, because obviously when they'd been on tour in America, Let It Bleed hadn't actually been released by that point, so a lot of the stuff they were playing was unreleased material. So by this point the crowds, they all actually knew these songs, but the Stones would still play some unreleased material during this 1970 tour, songs that were destined for Sticky Fingers. Brown Sugar, Dead Flowers, and I think it's You've Gotta Move. These 3 songs, which would obviously end up on Sticky Fingers, they were played quite a lot during the 1970 tour. Anyway, this tour would run until October 9th, 1970, and nothing has ever been officially released from this tour. There is some bootleg recordings out there, but no official recordings have ever been released. So anyway, despite Sticky Fingers actually being completed in 1970, it wouldn't be released that year, which would mean 1970 would be the first year since the Stones had gotten famous where they didn't release any new material. Fans simply had to make do with the live album, Get Your Ya-Ya's Out, which didn't have anything new on it, it was just live performances of older songs. So yeah, no new material in 1970, it was a first for the Rolling Stones. Anyway, as the band were heading towards 1971, there was another major problem about to head their way. 1971, and I've changed my clothes again. It's actually now been quite a few weeks since I recorded the previous bits of this video. I've been very busy, I've had a bad cold, all of that stuff, and you know, I don't want to be doing a video when I've got a bad cold. But I'm back, more different clothes now. Anyway, yes, 1971. So like I said there, the Stones, as they entered 1971, there was another problem heading their way. They discovered that they owed the British taxman quite a lot of money, because Alan Klein and his brilliant ways of managing things, he hadn't been paying their taxes. So now they owed the taxman a lot of money and they couldn't afford to pay what they owed. So basically the taxman was coming for them. They had to do something, they had to get out of England. So yeah, what were they gonna do? Well, their financial advisor came up with an idea, a get out of jail card effectively. So the British taxman, the British government, they couldn't seize any of the Stones' assets until the start of the next financial year. So this gave the Stones a little bit of a cooling off period so they could get out of England before they got their assets seized. So yeah, basically they were going to have to leave and become tax exiles in the south of France, they decided. Yeah, fun, eh? Now it's worth pointing out that these tax problems only actually affected Mick Jagger, Keith, Bill and Charlie. Mick Taylor, because he hadn't been in the band that long, he wasn't affected by this. If Brian Jones had still been alive, the chances are this would have applied to him as well, and even though he wasn't in the Stones anymore, he'd probably still have had to leave England, or cough up, one of the two. So yeah, it only affected 4 of the 5 Stones, but nevertheless, Mick Taylor was also going to have to do what the rest of them did. So before leaving to become tax exiles in the south of France, the Stones decided that they would do a quick tour of Britain. This would be their first tour of their homeland since 1966. They'd done the odd show here and there, like the Hyde Park gig in '69, but they hadn't done a proper tour where you could go, you could buy a ticket in whatever's nearest place for you to see them and go and see them. So yeah, this was the first time the British audiences could do that since 1966. Now this tour, it would serve as their only tour in 1971. It continued this pattern I mentioned earlier in the video of them touring America one year, then Europe the next, then the UK, then back to America, then Europe, and so on and so on. It would go on throughout most of the 70s. Anyway, this tour, it would run from March 4th until March 26th, 1971. March 26th was my birthday. So quite a short tour, but it was still quite a lot of shows on this tour, because most nights they would do 2 shows. They would do an afternoon gig and an evening gig. There are bootlegs that have been released from this tour. Quite a lot of it was recorded using the Stones' mobile recording studio. And the Leeds gig has also been released officially. It can be found on the 2015 deluxe edition of Sticky Fingers. So on the first date of the tour, March 4th, 1971, the Stones would actually announce that they were going to be moving away from England and moving to live in the south of France. This would therefore give the tour the name the Goodbye Britain Tour, because a lot of people thought this was her last hurrah, this was the last chance they would ever get to see the Stones live, because they would never come back to Britain after this. So yeah, there was quite a lot of sad fans, quite a lot of upset people about this. Anyway, in terms of the set list on this tour, it was more or less just the same as the 1970 European tour set list, except now with Sticky Fingers' release being imminent, there was a few more tracks added from Sticky Fingers. Wild Horses and Bitch would get added to the set, Brown Sugar and Dead Flowers and You Gotta Move were already in the set from the previous tour, so Sticky Fingers was now getting quite well represented. So Sticky Fingers would eventually release on April 23rd, 1971, and upon its release it would top the charts all around the world, including in the UK and in the US. The album would also be the first one that was released on the Rolling Stones' own record label, Rolling Stones Records, that they would release most of their records throughout the 70s and the 80s on. Now the logo for Rolling Stones Records, you've maybe seen it, it would eventually go on to become the Rolling Stones' actual logo for the band. It's the famous tongue logo, you know, that iconic tongue logo. I mean, you know it, don't you? This was the first time it ever appeared on the back cover of Sticky Fingers. At this point it was only intended to be their record label logo, but it would obviously eventually become the band itself's logo. Now, controversially, I've got to say, this logo, I don't really care for it that much. You know, if I'm buying a Rolling Stones t-shirt, I will do everything I can to avoid buying that bloody tongue. But anyway, this was the first time it ever appeared. It's obviously iconic, and yeah, this was where it made its debut on this album. So the artwork for Sticky Fingers, this iconic cover, and it is probably the Stones' most iconic album cover, this one, I would argue. Is it? Do you agree? Do you agree this is the Rolling Stones' most iconic album cover? I would say it is, personally. Anyway, it was designed by the legendary Andy Warhol. I love Andy Warhol. I've got a print of his in my kitchen. Anyway, yes, this cover, originally it had a gimmick on it. This zip, on original pressings, it was a physical zip that you could pull up and down. Now, the reason why it was eventually removed on later copies was because on the original pressings, when the vinyls were getting shipped out to the retailers, the zip was actually damaging the vinyls inside. So they were getting the copies of this album, but they were knackered. So what they would do to try and solve the problem was they would pull the zip halfway down, so that if it was going to do damage to the record, it would do it to the label in the middle rather than the actual music on the vinyl itself. Anyway, the zip itself, it was very expensive and it was damaging things, so on later pressings it would be replaced with just this 2D zip, which is a shame. If you have an original copy with the zip, it's probably worth quite a lot of money now. But yeah, unfortunately, we have to make do with just a 2D print. But it's still an iconic cover. Now obviously, since the Stones were now on their own record label, they ditched Decca. They didn't have to worry about Decca getting their knickers in a twist about the artwork being too offensive like they had done with Beggars Banquet. However, this artwork was still considered offensive to some people, the Spanish government in particular here. So in Spain at the time, this cover was not released. Instead, they got the quite famous also Can of Fingers cover. This cover is apparently less offensive. How it's less offensive, I don't know. It's a damn sight more disgusting. But the Spanish government deemed that was more suitable for public release than that. I don't get it either. So anyway, Sticky Fingers, it was very well received. Critics liked it, fans liked it. Once again, it continued this great streak of Rolling Stones albums. However, the Stones themselves, they couldn't really celebrate Sticky Fingers because they were busy having to relocate to the south of France while all this was going on.
Bill, how do you feel about emigrating?
I haven't thought about it yet.
You like the idea of going to France?
I don't know, are we really going?
Well, so they tell me.
I don't know.
How long would you go for?
I have to see if I like it first, you know. If I like it, it should be nice. Nice weather, sunshine.
Will you be sorry to leave Britain if you do go on this French emigration thing?
I don't know whether we are yet. It's not definite. We're thinking about it, you know. Of course I will. I've got my home here, family and everything, you know.
Great, Bill. Thank you. Can I have a quick word with Charlie? Thinking about the immigration, Charlie.
What one's that?
Going off to France.
Oh, I don't know. Very well.
Do you want to leave England or not?
No.
You're not keen on it?
On what?
On
England,
going off
no.
to France.
No.
You're keen on England?
No, I'm big. Help! Oh.
We're getting in trouble here. Hey, let me come around there, that's it. No, are you sorry to be leaving England or what?
Oh, yes. I'm in Newcastle at the moment. That's another problem, you know.
You don't really know about the French thing yet?
Yeah, of course I do, but I want to think about that after I've done Newcastle.
Okay, thanks very much, Charlie. Bye-bye.
So once the band were in France, Mick decided that he would settle in Paris. He was going to live in Paris, whereas Keith decided that he would rent a villa called Nelcot down in the south of France, near Nice. Nice is very nice. Bill, Charlie and Mick Taylor would also settle in the south of France, so they were all kind of near each other with the exception of Mick. However, the band actually now had another problem. There was no recording studios that they could find in the south of France, so they couldn't record their next album. They had nowhere to do it. There was nowhere for them to go to work. But they did have their mobile recording studio with them, so they decided that they would set up in the basement of Keith's villa, Nelcot, and this was where they would begin working on their next album, Exile on Main Street. So the Nelcot sessions for Exile would begin in mid-June 1971, and according to Bill Wyman, the band would work all night, every night for the rest of the month. So by this point, Keith was taking heroin, and thousands of pounds worth of heroin would be flowing through the manor every single day. Now during the sessions, which were taking place in the basement, Keith would often leave the sessions to go upstairs to have a fix of heroin. So yeah, that would kind of slow sessions down a bit when Keith disappeared to go and take his heroin. Now Mick was also frequently not at these sessions due to practical reasons. He lived in Paris at the time, so it wasn't so easy for him to go down to the south of France every single night at the other end of the country. So yeah, when he would eventually go down to the sessions, he would only be there for like a few days at a time where he would stay over, and then he would go back up to Paris, back home to Paris. So yeah, Mick wasn't there much, and neither was Bill Wyman because he simply didn't like the atmosphere that was going on in the villa and all the drugs that were flying about. So Keith was very much leading the Stones at this point. It was his band at this point. He was in the driving seat. He was the creative driving force of the band. He was in full control. He was leading the Nelcot sessions. Jimmy Miller was also still producing the Stones at this point. He was producing everything that was going on at Nelcot, although yeah, he was becoming a bit of a loose cannon at this point. And there was tensions also rising amongst the band because half of the Stones Stones were sort of very heavy drug takers at this point. Keith, Mick Taylor, Jimmy Miller, Bobby Keys, all these people, they were heavily taking drugs throughout the entire Nalcott sessions, whereas Mick Jagger, Charlie Watts and Bill Wyman, they weren't really taking drugs. Yeah, they took them here and there, but not to this extent, and yeah, this was creating quite a lot of tension within the ranks of the Rolling Stones. So these Nalcott sessions themselves, they've got quite a legendary status around them these days, and I think part of this status, it comes from the over-exaggerated story that Keith tells. So the way Keith tells the story is they've literally been chased out of England by the law. They are on the run from the cops. They have gone into hiding in the south of France, and they are now held up in this basement in this manor. And he even goes as far as to say that this manor, it's an ex-Gestapo headquarters, but this is kind of debated, but I'll get onto that. He claimed that there was, in the basement, there were swastikas carved into the concrete and into the sort of support beams and stuff from the Gestapo days, and the Stones were locked in here just recording their album. And this just makes it really, really exciting, the idea of them on the run and recording this, and it does help this album's story. Yeah, I think that's part of this album's charm. We'll get onto that at the end of the video, but it's the story that Keith tells. Now, like I say, this is kind of being exaggerated. They weren't chased out of England. They were kind of they just had to leave. They left by choice. At no point did the cops say, get out the country or anything like that. It's just that they owed the taxman a bit of money. That was it. It's not quite as exciting as Keith makes it sound. And in terms of the Gestapo thing, well, there's no actual evidence of Nalcott ever being a Gestapo headquarters. There's no evidence of the Gestapo ever having a headquarters in this region of the south of France. And the Nazis themselves, they were only in this part of France very briefly. I think it was from September 1943 until about August 1944. Anyway, they weren't there that long, so yeah, I mean, the manor itself is still there. It's kind of sealed off the public, you can't get to it or anything like that. I think it's owned by a Russian billionaire these days. So yeah, it's still there, but the sessions, they have this legendary status, and I buy into it. I love the story of this album and the Nalcott sessions, but when you read into it properly, they didn't actually really record and get that much done in Nalcott. The vast amount of it was done in the next bit I'm coming on to. But anyway, these Nalcott sessions, they would go on until August 1971, when they had to come to quite a sudden conclusion. So with the sheer amount of drugs that was flowing through Nalcott every single day, the police decided that they needed to move in and do something about this. However, Keith obviously knew that something was going to happen, because he decided that he would leave France. He decided to leg it, up sticks, get out of France as quick as he could. He would do this in August 1971, so yeah, that was why the Nalcott sessions ended, because Keith had now left France because the police were going to get him. Now, a few years later, in October 1973, a French court would actually prosecute Keith for trafficking cannabis during this period while he was at Nalcott, and as a consequence of this prosecution, he would be banned from entering France for 2 years, so from 1973 to 1975. Keith was not allowed into France. So with Keith having now left France, the Stones now needed to find somewhere else to record the rest of their album, to continue working on Exile on Main Street. They couldn't do it in France anymore anyway, Keith was gone. They would eventually settle on a proper studio this time, Sunset Sound Recorders in Los Angeles over in America, and this time Mick would take full control of the session. Keith had led the Nalcott sessions, but now Mick was in full control, and these sessions would prove to be a lot more productive and a lot more structured, I suppose, than any of the Nalcott sessions had been. So during the 2 months of Nalcott sessions, the basic tracks for Rocks Off, Rip This Joint, Casino Boogie, Tumbling Dice, Torn and Frayed, Happy, Turd on the Run, Ventilator Blues and Soul Survivor had all been completed. But that was it. They hadn't done any overdubs, so no vocals had been recorded up until this point, no additional guitars, additional instrumentation, nothing had been recorded, just the basic track. And that was only some of the songs they were intending for the album. There was still a load that still needed done. They hadn't done the basic tracks for. So yeah, Nalcott hadn't perhaps been the most productive of periods for the Stones. So these Los Angeles sessions for Exile would commence in December 1971, and they would continue on into the new year. So as the Stones entered 1972, work continued on Exile on Main Street in LA, and these sessions would continue until March 1972. Mick would also overdub some gospel-style vocals onto some of the tracks, and these were inspired by a visit to a local church where he'd seen Aretha Franklin recording Amazing Grace. So the LA sessions would prove to be a lot more productive than any of the Nalcott sessions had been. Nalcott had been a lot more free-flowing, a lot more loose, I suppose, a lot more rock and roll arguably, whereas LA, it had been a lot more workmanlike. They'd been like, come in at this time, we're doing this, we're doing that, we go home at that time. It was a lot more structured, and really the vast amount of this album, it was done in LA. So these two styles of sessions would also kind of encapsulate the growing disparity between Mick and Keith. They were both kind of wanting to control the Stones on their own, and they were both wanting to do it very differently, down very different paths. And yeah, this would carry on through a lot of the 70s and into the 80s. And yeah, obviously in the 80s they came very close to breaking up because of this. So yeah, this is kind of where it started around this period in 1972. So once the album was complete, attention then turned to the cover art. For this, Mick wanted a cover that reflected the band as runaway outlaws using the blues as its weapon against the world, showcasing feeling of joyful isolation grinning in the face of a scary and unknown future. The Stones were photographed at their Bel Air mansion for the cover, and Mick was also taken for photographs on Los Angeles Main Street. Jagger would also select some pre-existing photos for the cover, including the photo of Freeball Charlie. Anyway, once the collage was completed for the cover, the album was finally ready to go. Exile on Main Street was released on the 12th of May 1972, and upon its release it would top the charts all over the world, including in both the UK and the US. The album would be the Stones' first double album and was preceded by the lead single Tumbling Dice, which peaked at number 5 in the UK and number 7 in the US. However, at the time of its release, critics were actually quite divided on the album, and quite a lot of them were very critical about it because they felt the songs were inconsistent. However, by the end of the 70s and onwards, critical response to this album, it did improve, and now most people will refer to this as the Rolling Stones' greatest album. Anyway, this album will continue this streak of great albums the Stones have been on, and for many people this is the peak of the streak and it's where it ends, because a lot of people feel after this the wheels came off and they never reached these heights again. I don't agree with that personally, but some people will argue that point. So after the release of Exile, Adolph Klein decided that he would rear his fat ugly head again and sue the Rolling Stones for breach of settlement with his company. Now Klein claimed that 5 of the songs that were on Exile had been written whilst Mick and Keith were still under contract with his company, so Alan Klein therefore claimed that he should own the copyrights, the publishing rights, to those 5 tracks. The songs in question were Sweet Virginia, Loving Cup, All Down the Line, Shine a Light and Stop Breaking Down. And unfortunately, Klein won the case, so therefore he gained the publishing rights to those 5 tracks, and therefore he would start making money off this album. What a horrible little man he truly was. Anyway, following the release of Exile, the Stones decided that they wanted to go on tour in America again. Now this would be their first tour of the States since the 1969 tour, and their first concert since the Altamont gig in December of '69. It would also continue this 3-year rotating cycle they were on of America, Europe, UK, then start again with America, Europe, UK, etc. So yeah, this was sort of the restart of that cycle for the first time. The tour would run from July 3rd, 1972 until July 26th, 1972. Now for the set list for this tour, a number of tracks from Exile will get added onto the set, and for the first time since they'd started touring again, this was the first time where nothing was performed live pre-1968. So by this point, everything in the set list was now Beggar's Banquet onwards. So you might notice each one of these tours I've mentioned, I've said that they gradually add more songs from them corresponding albums. Well, now we're at the point where all the songs in the sets are from those albums, or their covers, one of the two. So yeah, they kind of now really reached the peak of this streak where they could now just perform recent songs from their most recent albums. So yeah, basically by this point the Stones were just ready to ride high on the wave of all these great songs they created over the last few years. And for many people out there, they will argue that this tour, this 1972 US tour, is the best tour the Stones ever did. And yeah, I'd probably have to agree with that, to be honest. Either this or the 1973 European tour. Either one of them two is one of the best tours. They're kind of on par with each other, really. So the 1972 tour would also produce 2 concert films, the first of which was called Ladies and Gentlemen the Rolling Stones, and this would originally see a limited theatre release in 1974. Now this concert film wouldn't be made available to the masses to buy until 2010, so it went quite a long time unreleased, and the audio from this concert film has also been made available as a live album called Ladies and Gentlemen the Rolling Stones. That was released in 2017. The second film from this tour was supposed to be a documentary called Cocksucker Blues, but it's never been released, and the reason why is what the idea of this documentary was the documentary creators, they basically put a load of cameras down backstage, and anyone who was travelling with the Stones or the Stones themselves were just supposed to pick this camera up and start filming whatever was going on, just basically to try and tell the story of this tour. Now, a court order would stop this from being released because pretty much the stuff that was getting filmed, it was parties backstage and drugs being taken. There was even footage of someone taking heroin in the film, so yeah, court order stopped that from being released. It's still never been released to this day. You can see it on bootleg, but officially it's never been released. It's never even really been spoke about. Now, no proper live album at the time was released from this tour, and the Stones did actually intend to release a live album. They actually went as far as having a front and back cover designed for this intended live album, and would even begin working on some studio touch-ups for some of the tracks. However, this live album would end up getting scrapped due to contractual disputes with Klein. Basically, the Stones wanted Klein to make money off this live album, so yeah, that's why it never seen the light of day, and it still never has to this day. The closest thing we've ever had to a live album from this tour is the Ladies and Gentlemen, the Rolling Stones live album that was released in 2017, but that's still not like a proper live album. It's literally just the audio from the film put onto disc or streaming or whatever, so it's not like had studio touch-ups, or like it's not the best sounding quality through headphones basically. So yeah, that's about all we've ever had from this tour, the Stones' best tour arguably. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where we are going to end this story. This is where we're going to get off the train now with the 1972 tour. Basically, what happened next, very briefly, is when this tour finished, they would then begin working on their next album, Goat's Head Soup. But we're not going to talk about that today, because a lot of people will argue that that album is where the streak ended, that it's not as good as the 4 albums that have just been. It's where the wheels came off. I don't personally agree with that view. I think Goat's Head Soup is as good an album as any of the other ones that are on this streak. But the general consensus with a lot of people is it's not good enough, basically. So that's a story for another day, Goat's Head Soup. But yeah, this is where we're going to end the story, because this is where a lot of people argue the streak ends. Anyway, I think it's fair to say that 1968 until 1972 was the Stones at their absolute peak. They were absolutely untouchable during this period. Every album they made, every single they put out, it was just gold dust. It was hit after hit after hit. It was banger after banger after banger. You know, Gimme Shelter, Sympathy for the Devil, Jumpin' Jack Flash, Honky Tonk Women, Brown Sugar, Wild Horses, Tumbling Dice. All these songs originated during this quite short period of time, really. So yeah, the band, they were completely untouchable at this point. Just everything they did was utter brilliance. I suppose, therefore, it's no wonder that it was during this period in their tours where they started being introduced and referred to as the greatest rock and roll band
in the world.
So great album streaks then. Well, here's a streak for you. There's a bloody great streak for you. I mean, I've spent, what, an hour telling you the story of this period? So if that doesn't make you realise how great a streak this is, well, I don't know what else will. I think it's pretty remarkable as well that with everything they had going on at this point, whether it's with Klein, or Brian Jones dying, or all the stuff at Altamont, or the stuff having to become tax exiles, all of that stuff, they still managed to create great albums and do great tours and all of that stuff. Like, most bands would be crumbling under all the pressure that the Stones were under at this point, and yet the Stones just carried on as if everything was alright. Now for me personally, I would say that Sticky Fingers is the best of these 4 albums. If I had to rank them, it would be this order: Sticky Fingers at number 1, Exile at number 2, Beggar's Banquet number 3, and Let It Bleed at number 4. I'm not saying that Let It Bleed's a bad album, I just think it's not as good as the other 3 personally. Now, whilst I've been making this video, because it's the length of it and stuff, I've been doing it in sections, so I'll record each section in one go. So like 1960, I'd record that, then have a rest a few days, then I'd do the 69 version, then have a rest, and then 70, so on. And whilst I was having that rest between each one, I was intently listening to the corresponding albums. So initially I was listening to a lot of Beggar's Banquet, then a lot of Let It Bleed, then a lot of Sticky Fingers, and a lot of Exile, just to fully familiarise myself with the albums again, because Sticky Fingers and Exile, I listened to them quite a bit. But Beggar's Banquet and Let It Bleed, I hadn't listened to them for quite some time in full from start to finish. Obviously I'd listened to the odd track here and there, but in terms of listening to them in full, I hadn't for a while, and I'd forgotten how great songs like Factory Girl and Dear Doctor and Jigsaw Puzzle and Stray Cat Blues and Live With Me and Monkey Man and stuff like that, how great some of these songs were that just went under the radar. Deep cuts, I suppose. Anyway, the reason why I'm bringing that up is I'm so pleased actually that I have listened to these albums again whilst recording this video, because it's kind of made me fall in love with them again. Even though I've never fallen out of love with them, I've kind of rediscovered them. It's like, I'm trying to think of an example here, where you haven't had a food that you really like for a long time, and then you have it again, and that taste, when you first taste that taste that you love for the first time in ages, it's kind of that feeling with me in these albums, like getting to rediscover them all again. It's been brilliant, it really has. Now, I can't talk about these 4 albums and not talk about the opening tracks, because in terms of the 4 opening tracks here, they are 4 of the greatest opening tracks of all time. Sympathy for the Devil on Beggar's Banquet, Gimme Shelter on Let It Bleed, Brown Sugar on Sticky Fingers, and Rocks Off on Exile. Now, to be fair, Rocks Off, it isn't quite as well known as the other 3, because Rocks Off, it was never a single. But Rocks Off, I think, perfectly encapsulates what Exile is about. This sort of, yeah, this outlaws on the run kind of thing. It just sounds like they're just this Band on the Run, it just sounds great. That's a different album altogether, Band on the Run, but yeah. Whereas the other three, they're obviously three very big hit singles, and yeah, they're three of the greatest tracks ever recorded. Now, I've always said that the opening track is the most important track on an album, and I stand by that, and this is precisely the reason why I argue that point, because these tracks, they perfectly pull you in, they make you want to listen to the rest of it. You know, if you pick a bad opening track, people are going to switch the album off, they're not going to listen all the way through. The vast amount of people, there will be some like hardcore fans who it won't bother them, they'll keep going, they'll persevere. But most people, if your opening track's crap, they'll be out of there, they won't hang around for the rest of it. And yeah, the Stones completely ace it here with their selection of opening tracks. Now, all these opening tracks are great ones, but Gimme Shelter is the best of the lot. There's an argument to make that Gimme Shelter could be the greatest song ever recorded. It is utterly brilliant. I mean, in some ways, kind of in a backhanded way, it ruins Let It Bleed, because it's that good. It opens that strong that the rest of the album, it can't recover. The rest of the album can't keep up with a song that good. And the thing is, Let It Bleed, it's not a bad album by any means. The rest of the tracks on the album, they're all brilliant tracks, except Midnight Rambler. But the rest of them are all brilliant tracks. It's just Gimme Shelter completely overshadows the rest of them because it is that good a song. Yeah, it's an incredible song, really. And I've got to say, the opening riff on Gimme Shelter, it is just so iconic. It is just so brilliant. I mean, it must have been brilliant in 1969 to buy Let It Bleed, put the album on and be greeted with that opening riff. I mean, nothing will have ever sounded like that. It must have blown so many people's minds. Every time I hear that riff, it makes me want to pick up a guitar and play it. And unfortunately, I can't play the riff. But my brother can play it. So, you know, if you, for some reason, have got this far into the video and you don't know how brilliant it is, you're going to hear it now. Show them how it's done, James. Cheers, James. Right, anyway, these four albums, they all feel like a natural progression from each other, although they also feel very different. Beggar's Banquet is a very different album to Exile on Main Street. Beggar's Banquet is actually quite an acoustic album, whereas Exile is very much a rock and roll album. Sticky Fingers has quite a lot of ballads on it, and Let It Bleed is just Let It Bleed, really. But they're very different albums, and yet they all feel like a natural progression, like they're a natural move, like step up from the album before. Now, like I say, Sticky Fingers is my favourite of the lot because I think personally, track for track, that is the one where every single track on the album is brilliant. Exile is a very close second. The only reason why I prefer Sticky Fingers to Exile is I feel Exile drops off a little bit on side 4. That last few tracks on the album kinda don't flow as great, in my opinion anyway. So in terms of whether I personally think this is the greatest streak of albums of all time, it's always something I've been a bit divided on whether I can fully commit to this being the greatest streak of albums of all time, because I'm going to go back to the classic Beatles and Stones thing, because I've always felt Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, White Album, Abbey Road is a better streak than this. But obviously that's not like a full streak because Yellow Submarine comes in between the White Album and Abbey Road and that kills that streak completely. So, but then Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, White Album is an equally still great streak, but then some will argue, well, there's Magical Mystery Tour, although that wasn't a proper album at the time, so it gets a bit funny with that. And I don't feel that's quite, it's a good album, I don't feel it's quite as good on this, in terms of continuing a great streak between Pepper and the White Album, but anyway. So yes, in terms of whether I think these four albums are the greatest streak of albums of all time, no, I'm sorry, I've got to give it to the Beatles. Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, even them three albums alone is a great streak. And then the White Album, yeah. I'm sorry, I can't commit to this. It's very close, it really is. And, you know, I mean, this isn't a bad streak by any means. I absolutely love it. It's just I can't bring myself to say it's better than any of the Beatles streaks because the Beatles, you know, did a great stuff. Anyway, these four albums from the Stones, I absolutely adore them. I always have done. I'll love them for the rest of my life. And yeah, they're just brilliant. They are four of the all-time greats, especially Sticky Fingers and Exile. It's just brilliant. Right, we're going to conclude this here once and for all. This has been a very long video, so thank you very, very much if you've made it through all this. I genuinely do appreciate that. I've got to say, this video, it's the most work I've ever put into a video so far. In terms of editing, there's been so much editing on this video. Not that I don't enjoy doing it. What else was there be? I was going to say something else. A lot of research has obviously gone into this as well. It's just, yeah, I think this has turned out quite a good video. Personally, I think this is potentially the best video I've ever made, but that's not for me to decide. That's for you, the viewers, to decide. Anyway, I do want to hear what you think as well. I don't just want me rambling on for an hour and a bit. So please do comment below what you think is the greatest streak of albums of all time. Do you think it's these 4 albums? If you don't, what do you think is the greatest streak of albums? Please do let me know. It'd be very nice to hear your opinions, your thoughts, your own personal favourite streaks. Maybe something I've never even thought of. Some of the streaks you come up with. Anyway, I am going to end it there, so thank you very much for watching. Like and subscribe if you've enjoyed this, all that jazz. And yeah, I will see you next time on another video, hopefully. Till then though, do take care.